Hello my fellow strawmen and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today I found a video about evolution and God that I find intriguing. It's from a channel called Convincing Proof, run by a guy named Adam Johnson. Adam has a PhD in philosophy of religion, and from the cross on the wall and the heads in the foreground, I'm guessing that he's some kind of lecturer at a seminary or something. So even though his YouTube presence isn't much bigger than mine, I figure he's got enough influence and is a fair enough representative to be worth responding to. This video is the third in a series on apologetics for teens, linked in the description as always. I do intend to go over the rest of the playlist, but each video stands on its own, so I figure there's no harm in going out of order. Anyway, let's hear what Adam has to say about evolution.
Today what we're going to do is look at the number one objection to the design of life argument. And I think I mentioned this last week, but as you can imagine, the way that that argument is pushed back against often is through evolution, the theory of evolution.
And this statement pretty much explains why I'm responding to this video. I believe that evolution took place and is still taking place, and is a sufficient explanation for the incredible complexity of life. Just to confirm that I am pushing back exactly the way Adam expects, here is the graphic I came up with at the end of my video addressing the watchmaker argument. If you're trying to convince me that something was intelligently designed, step 1 is basically showing the incredible functionality of something, like a jumbo jet or a modern cell, which clearly were not just randomly whipped into being. Step 2 is to say that the thing does not self-replicate. I go into much more detail in that video, but this step is all about ruling out the possibility of evolution. It is absolutely the key step to me, which provides an alternative explanation to God for the complexity of life.
Okay, so this is the thought process that we're going to walk through. We're going to start with this question. Does evolution prove that there is no God?
No, of course not. I'm happy to say that evolution is a powerful counter-argument to the teleological argument for God, but it's not good evidence that God doesn't exist. Let's be clear about my position. If you ever want to hear me argue against God's existence, we've got to talk about my argument of ice. But evolution is far more agnostic towards God's existence.
So first of all, we could say if evolution is false, then certainly it doesn't prove there's no God, right? I think that's pretty obvious. Evolution can't prove there's no God if evolution itself is incorrect. So in that regard, I'm going to present what I think is the best argument against evolution.
And this will be the main point I focus on in my response. I think there are good reasons to believe that evolution is true, and even though it's not a proof against God, its ability to defeat the teleological argument does make it a point against God's existence.
Even if evolution is true, this still doesn't prove that there is no God.
Agreed. Of course, I think evolution is true, but my disbelief in God is not founded on my belief in evolution. If I had reason to think that God existed and that evolution happened, I'd have no trouble making a worldview that could account for both. Adam then spends a few minutes explaining how evolution works, and to his credit, he does a fair enough job with it. I'll assume that my audience is mostly familiar with it, and if not, then go do some research on your own, learn a bit about what it is, and then you can come back and listen to this response.
The question then becomes, the question that's a bit more controversial, is how powerful is this process? In other words, through enough generations, what can this process accomplish? Is it powerful enough, given enough time, is it powerful enough to create a completely new type of organism?
I think that this question betrays one of Adam's misunderstandings about evolution. Evolution does not produce completely new species from scratch. It produces variants, and then variants of those variants, and so on until you have something completely unfamiliar to what came originally. When you think about humans and bananas being related, it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, we're both just different kinds of cells. Luca was a primitive cell, and some of its descendants became multicellular, others stayed unicellular. Some developed cell walls and photosynthesis and became the group known as plants, others developed motility and became animals. And subgroups of each of these went on to become bananas and humans. Neither of these are completely new, they're just different kinds of cells.
This is the question that is a bit more controversial. Darwin, as you know, speculated that it is in fact powerful enough to produce brand new types of organisms. And that is why his book was titled On the Origin of Species. Do you think it was reasonable for Darwin, based on the small-scale evolution he observed, to propose the hypothesis that this process could produce new species? In other words, given enough time, would produce large-scale evolution.
Sure, it seems like a natural conclusion of taking many small evolutionary steps. And although Adam doesn't think the hypothesis is true, he does think it's reasonable, and since he spends the next few minutes discussing the nuances of this agreement, I'll skip to the next part I would challenge.
The question then, with his hypothesis then, is it correct? Is it true? Is this process powerful enough to create completely new types of organisms? Or is there a limit to it?
Yeah, of course there are limits. You could not see an organism evolve out of its clade. New subgroups can form within a clade and become clades of their own, distinct from what was before. But evolution would be limited to stay within a given clade. For example, evolution could not account for a creature which was half and half from two unrelated species. No human heads on shark bodies, no walrus bodies with lobster tails, no pine trees with parrot feathers. I don't see how a god would be limited to be unable to make such things, but certainly evolution would have such limits.
We learned that the genes themselves are not changing, okay? The genes aren't changing, they're just being reshuffled in different combinations. So you have a certain combination of half of your mom's genes, half of your dad's genes, but your sibling has a different combination of half of your mom's genes and half of your dad's genes. That's why siblings are different. In other words, no new information is being created. There's just a shuffling process going on here, which causes different traits, different heights, different weights, different hair colors, different eye colors, etc., etc. All the traits about your physical and mental self is because of the shuffling of those genes.
This is misleading. Adam is describing recombination, which is a process that occurs during sexual reproduction and benefits the species by allowing natural selection to act more efficiently. However, it's far from the only process of random change on which natural selection can act. Look at point mutations or insertions and deletions, or any other mutation caused by a miscopying of the DNA. All of these processes, including recombination, result in new information. Consider that DOG and GOD are the same letters just shuffled around and yet convey completely different information. Reshuffling or changing the data in any way is a change to the information.
Microevolution, that is the gene pool being shuffled around, offspring getting a different combination of genes from their respective parents.
To clarify, this is not what I mean by microevolution. Recombination of genes is one mechanism that produces variation in a population, but it's not the only one, and in fact it is unique to sexual reproduction. Mutations themselves are a much more important factor for asexual reproduction, which is all that the simplest organisms early on would have had access to.
So with these discoveries of genes and other discoveries, now that we know better how these traits are passed on to the next generation, people have learned then that this can't explain the origin of new species, because there's no new information being created.
Since this is one of his main problems with evolution, I have to emphasize that it all just boils down to a simple misunderstanding. Information in DNA is dependent on the order of the nucleotides, and by changing that order, new information is, by definition, created. A reshuffling of the nucleotides codes for a different amino acid and changes how the protein folds, producing a new protein out of novel genetic information.
To create a brand new species, there has to be more information than just what's there in the gene pool. So how does this new information come about? And this is the new theory that then has been presented, the theory of mutations.
Mutations which we can track directly. Now, I myself have never done this, but it's my understanding that scientists can sequence a living organism and its descendant and compare the genomes to literally find the mutations. They happen, they're not just theoretical.
They claim that this is the key ingredient which provides the new information to go from microevolution, which we all agree to macroevolution, to create brand new species. Micro happens with existing information, genes already there being reshuffled, but they're claiming now that for macroevolution to take place, to really build something new, there has to be new information from somewhere, something that's not already in the gene pool. And they're claiming that mutations then provide this new information.
I think another misconception Adam may have about evolution is this idea that microevolution is represented by the mixing up of genes between individuals, by simple recombination. But evolution is not meant to apply at an individual scale. It applies at the scale of populations. If my parents' generation has kids, then each one is just a reshuffling of the old genes, but across the population it's still the same distribution of genes, then that's not even microevolution. Evolution is when some genes become more or less common in the population, when they die out entirely, and importantly, when entirely new ones are created by mutations.
A mutation is not a good thing. A mutation is a random change that occurs at the molecular level in DNA. It can be caused by all sorts of things like radiation, viruses, chemicals, errors in the DNA replication process. So all sorts of things can cause these accidents to happen in the gene, in the DNA. These mistakes, if you will.
Despite Adam's good intentions, this is a misrepresentation of mutations. They are not exclusively harmful. Depending on the selective pressures of the organism's niche, they can be beneficial or harmful, and are most often quite neutral. And given that the fitness of the mutations is highly dependent on the environment, there is no practical way I know of to connect the changes in the DNA with some prediction of whether it'll be good or bad for the organism. The only way I know how to tell is to just let it play out.
So each accident has to be useful, each mutation has to be useful in and of itself.
Yes, but it's important to bear two things in mind. First, that environments can change over time, and so what is fit can also change. And second, structures can be exapted. They can be used for a new function. It's important to remember these and to not judge the fitness of the ancestor by the standards of its descendants.
Behe points out that there are complex biological machines within biological life that just can't be built one accidental step at a time, because all the pieces are required to be there at once for the mechanism to work. Think of your eye, for example, and all of the aspects of the eye that have to be there together at the same time or it wouldn't work. And he points out that something as complex like the eye can't be put together step by step because it takes all the pieces there at the same time to work.
But this is the problem. By work, Adam means something that has the abilities of a modern human eye, which can see in color 3D. And he's saying that the transitions won't work, and so they can't exist. But for our long-distant ancestors, it's entirely plausible that having blurry vision without lenses was beneficial in their time. And before them, it was useful to have light-sensitive cells, which were useful to the simpler organisms that lived then. And their ancestors must have had some precursor to those light-sensitive cells, perhaps some signaling pathway which made the organism move and had a protein which could mutate into something light-sensitive.
It's literally nanotechnology in a sense. It's a nano machine, a tiny little motor on the back of certain cells. If you see all of these parts, and I'm going to show you a video here in just a minute that explains more of this from a professional scientist, but all these parts have to be there at the same time for this motor to work.
As a motor, sure. But if there were parts missing, perhaps it could still be used for other functions. Perhaps the precursors to this motor weren't used as a motor at all, and spinning started out as a secondary function. This is what I was talking about when I said you can't judge the fitness of the ancestor by the standards of its descendants. Don't judge the fitness of the motor precursor proteins by how good of a motor it is. We would have to know something about what that precursor was used for, and how it got to where it was from its precursor, and so on. And if we don't know anything about those precursors, if we don't even know what they might be, then I don't see how we can honestly rule out the possibility that these systems evolved. Adam goes on to show a clip from the Discovery Institute, which is supposed to demonstrate why the bacterial flagellum could not have evolved. And during my process of trying to trim the several minute-long clip down to its key points to make it more manageable for my video, I realized that it never actually makes any relevant point at all. It just talks about the complexity of the mechanism and says that any one of the components being modified would prevent it from functioning. And sure, maybe it wouldn't function to move the bacteria, but there's no attempt whatsoever to consider what precursor functions may have existed. Functionality does not have to remain the same. It can change, and pieces can improve gradually over generations, stumbling onto new side effects as they go. So I'm happy to grant that if any of the 30 pieces of this motor were changed, they wouldn't work together as a motor. But that isn't to say that they couldn't have any use, and therefore could not have been selected for. It isn't enough to show that these nanoscale protein machines could not have evolved. And to be absolutely clear about my position, I don't know of any direct evidence in favor that these machines evolved. I would only say they did as an inference. If evolution does not produce nanoscale protein machines, then macroevolution cannot occur. We have evidence of macroevolution occurring, primarily in the form of genetics falling into a cladistic pattern, the relationship between geography and the distribution of related species, and the fossil record. Therefore, since we have reason to think macroevolution happens, it's reasonable to infer that evolution can account for the protein nanomachines. I'm open to evidence to the contrary, but I haven't heard any yet.
Okay, I do think this is a good argument. My opinion is that I do think this is a strong argument against macroevolution. However, it's kind of ended in a stalemate. So one side, be he, for example, those who don't think macroevolution has taken place, that side says, look, it seems impossible to build a complex machine like the bacterial flagellum or the human eye. It seems impossible to build such a complex machine with one accident, one mutation at a time. That just seems impossible. The other side says, no, it doesn't seem impossible to us. We have some models, for example, which show that it conceptually is possible. And they've come up with models and ideas to show how this could have happened. What would be nice is if the side, right, the side who claims that it's possible, it would be really nice for them if they had, let's say, for example, an empirical example.
As I said, I don't know any good empirical examples of novel biomachinery, personally. Maybe there's some cell biologist out there who can help me out, but from my position, it's besides the point. I'm only inferring that these machines can be produced because they seem necessary for evolution, and I have other good reasons to believe evolution happens. Never forget the honest starting position, which is to assume we know nothing. We don't know whether protein nanomachines inside the cell evolved. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know how to demonstrate for sure that they did, and here's how. But I also don't think I've been given a good reason to believe that they couldn't have evolved, that their existence disproves evolution, and that therefore the only cause that could account for the complexity of life is God. That's the argument Adam wants to make, and the burden of proof does not lie with me to show how these nanomachines evolved. The burden lies with him to show that they could not. The fact that it seems impossible, that it doesn't align with his intuition, is no argument at all.
Now, fruit flies are a great example because they have such a short lifespan, and we can watch the process in action. Scientists have bombarded these poor fruit flies with radiation to increase the rate of mutations. And so we've been able to see what mutations actually accomplish in these poor fruit flies.
I'm a bit confused what this is meant to demonstrate. Evolution would predict that these flies will stay flies. Maybe they have more varied internal biochemistry or weird physiologies, but without a selection pressure, I wouldn't expect anything more than just genetic drift. I wouldn't expect them to turn into crabs or something, not in this kind of time frame anyway. I can't even go look up specifics from this study because Adam doesn't mention it, and there are way too many studies about fruit flies for me to try to find the one he's talking about.
Now, all but just a handful of these mutations we've caused to these flies have been irrelevant. They don't help at all. Most of the mutations are extremely detrimental to their ability to either survive or to reproduce. So the vast majority of mutations are destructive, not constructive. However, there have been some mutations that are helpful. But even with these helpful mutations, they don't create any new information. There's no evidence of mutations creating new complex structures. They're merely altering existing structures that are already there.
On altering structures, let's not forget that fingernails, hair, and toenails of humans, as well as various horns, feathers, scales, and hooves of animals, are all made of keratin and only differ in structure. The same can be said of chitin for arthropods or lignin for plants. Varying the structure may be all life needs to come up with new features. And as I've said before, any change to the genetic code is new information. It's literally the definition. All mutations create new information, and the information that is detrimental gets selected out. It almost doesn't matter how common these detrimental mutations are, because they get weeded out. As long as beneficial mutations occur, and Adam has agreed that they do, then evolution can select for them and they can accumulate, eventually resulting in macroevolution.
Sometimes in the evolutionary process, breaking things is useful. A great example of this is found in the eternal back and forth between malaria and sickle cell anemia. Now, malaria is a wonderful example. It gives us a wonderful empirical example of the power of mutation to drive evolution. And why is that? Well, just the numbers alone. Malaria grows to huge population numbers. The numbers are so much greater than any mammals, reptiles, or insects that we could study. So we can watch malaria mutate, and it does. We can watch it mutate over trillions of generations in just a few years.
This is a massive overestimate. Malaria has a life cycle which takes about a month, depending on the species. Even granting that it reproduces as fast as some bacteria, on the order of a generation every few hours, then you get maybe 3 generations a day, which is 1,000 generations a year. At that rate, it'd still take 1 billion years to see 1 trillion generations. In the time frame that we've had to study malaria, I'd be amazed if we had more than a few tens of thousands of generations recorded. I'd expect to see some change, sure, but not a ton, and certainly not enough to fully demonstrate the millions and billions of years of evolution that I think have actually happened.
And let me explain a little bit what sickle cell anemia is, because this is often referred to by evolutionists as a classic example of mutation working with natural selection to accomplish things. It does accomplish something, but I'm going to show that it accomplishes something by breaking things, not creating anything new.
Except when you're talking about biology and chemistry, breaking things does make new things. Chemical reactions are literally breaking reactants apart and rejoining them together to make molecules which didn't previously exist. This idea that a biological mechanism can be broken is a misunderstanding. What the malaria sickle cell example demonstrates is that whether a mutation breaks what was before or it improves what was before, it depends to some degree on the environment itself. The exact same mutation can, under different circumstances, be either beneficial or harmful. There is nothing about this which precludes evolution from creating complex biochemistry.
So in other words, Behe points out that we can't jump from this simple example of mutation and natural selection working well together to conclude that all the complex machinery that we see, the human eye, the human brain, can be explained through natural selection and mutation.
I agree, this would be a bad piece of evidence to jump to the conclusion of evolution with. Luckily, I don't do that. It's nowhere in my top 3 list for pieces of evidence for evolution. I've gone more in depth on each of these in other videos, but frankly, there's way better resources than me if you want to go look these up yourself. Sickle cell anemia is not my example in favor of evolution. No, Adam is trying to present it as a counterexample to evolution, and since he's agreed that it's a fine example of natural selection acting on mutations, I don't see how that's been demonstrated.
It is a good example of what mutation and natural selection can do, but it's also a great example of what natural selection and mutation can't do. As I keep saying, it hasn't really built anything new, it's actually broken things. But sometimes breaking things can be useful. Sometimes burning the bridge, so to speak, can prevent your enemy from chasing after you.
This is just not a good analogy. One, sickle cell is barely an example of microevolution in humans. Really, it's just an example of allele variance. It's not on topic for the macroevolution Adam is trying to deny. Two, maybe burning a bridge to protect yourself is a bit like sacrificing oxygen capacity in blood in favor of malaria resistance. But the allele for the normal hemoglobin is still present and dominant within the population. It isn't lost, and unless malaria spreads worldwide and becomes a major factor to most people, I don't see how that would ever change. The mutation doesn't burn the genetic bridge, so to speak.
So here's Behe. He wrote, slowing and eventually damming the flow of water doesn't require sophisticated structures, just a lot of debris. Genetic debris can accumulate in cells too. And if it accidentally does some good, then it can be favored by natural selection.
And third, a dam is not a bridge. Even if it's made of the same materials, it's a new structure with a new function. There's this concept I think a lot of theists have about how each protein in our bodies has a particular role, and if that role is lost, then the protein is broken. But whether it's broken is a relative term and highly dependent on the environment. The ones that really are broken from a fitness perspective get weeded out, and only the ones with novel functionality or improved functionality stick around. What Behe and Adam are missing is that if evolution is favoring the mutation, then it isn't debris. If it is debris, it gets selected out.
So here we have genetic empirical studies of thousands and thousands, trillions upon trillions of generations, with very little biochemical significance to show for it.
If we want to understand how the malaria parasite adapts to the human body, we can look at its generational time to put some limits on how quickly it can evolve. But if we look at how quickly humans adapt to the parasite with sickle cell, then we have to look at the human generation time, which is much longer. And so humans wouldn't be expected to evolve as quickly. I think Adam is confusing the rate at which malaria reproduces, which is vastly overestimated anyway, with the much slower rate at which humans reproduce, and which he should be using.
So I think Behe has done a good job by showing empirical evidence that at least we have not seen, we have not observed mutations and natural selection building complex structures.
Imagine if I made the argument that I have never seen God, therefore he doesn't exist. Pretty bad argument, right? So when Adam says that we haven't seen macroevolution create new complex structures, sure, but I wouldn't really expect to see that happen in my lifetime, and so not seeing it isn't a good reason to say it couldn't have happened.
However, let's spend the rest of our time now on the second part. I would say that even if evolution is true, let's say I'm wrong, let's say B, he is wrong, and evolution, macroevolution in fact, is true, I would say if that's the case, it still doesn't prove that there is no God.
I'd agree, so I'll keep my comments in this section brief. Of course, evolution does not require a God, and it is compatible with atheism. But it's also compatible with a God because God could do all things, and maybe there's some reason for him to use evolution as his mechanism of creation. I would never use evolution to claim that God doesn't exist. And I'm a Gnostic atheist who does claim that God doesn't exist, just not for this reason.
It might weaken the design of life argument, okay? I say might, may weaken.
Evolution may not be able to carry the burden of proof to demonstrate God's non-existence. But Paley's watchmaker argument is trying to point to the complexity of modern life as proof of God, because what else could create such complex biochemistry except him? When evolution is brought up as an alternative explanation, it doesn't solve everything. It doesn't solve the primordial beginning of life itself, of abiogenesis. But if you can recognize that our knowledge of such an event is obscured by time, and you can accept that maybe it is, maybe it isn't possible, then if it is possible, then evolution could get you the rest of the way. It means that Paley's argument cannot rule out all natural explanations, and thus cannot demonstrate the existence of a supernatural designer.
Take a look at this quote from Stephen Barr. William Paley, finds a watch and asks how such a thing could have come to be there by chance. Dawkins, evolutionary scientist Richard Dawkins, finds an immense automated factory, evolutionary process, that blindly constructs watches and feels that he's completely answered Paley's point, the design argument for God. But that's absurd. How can a factory that makes watches be less in need of an explanation than the watches themselves?
There is a fundamental problem in just about every analogy I've ever heard for why we should infer design from the complexity of life. The key feature that life has, which is necessary for the evolutionary explanation, is that life self-replicates. It's not that there's a factory producing the watches, it's that the watches are self-replicating. The watches are the factory. And yes, the modern self-replicating watch you pick up on the beach is very impressive. It keeps time precisely and is robust to you shaking it. But maybe millions of generations ago, its ancestors kept time well, but not if you shook them. And millions of generations before them, their precursors kept time poorly. And for some reason, those who were better at timekeeping had better rates of survival and reproduction, so that the population gradually became what it is today. But way back, all of those other features could have been absent, and the most primordial watch wasn't really a watch at all, just a simple self-replicating system. And all the other features must have come gradually.
Darwinian evolution, if it's true, far from disproving the necessity of a cosmic designer, may actually point to it. We now have the problem of explaining not merely a butterfly's wing, but a universe that can produce a butterfly's wing.
So yes, if evolution is true, then abiogenesis must have happened. And yes, every creature which ever lived must have some evolutionary path to where they got from that origin point. And I would love to know those things in more detail. I would love to know how generations of organisms were selected by their very nature to lead to the beautiful fluttering colors of a butterfly wing. I would love to know how inorganic chemistry came to actively utilize energy in its environment to become organic biochemistry. But if I don't know these things, that's not a reason to rule out that they're possible. It's a reason to be curious and to want to know more. And if I may turn Stephen's quote around, how do we explain not merely a universe that can produce a butterfly's wing, but a God who can produce a universe that can produce a butterfly's wing? Or even if evolution didn't happen, how do we explain a God who can produce a butterfly's wing? It just kicks the can down the line and does nothing to solve the problem of origin.
We can also push back in the sense that evolution can explain the origin of life.
I agree. Unfortunately for Adam, he doesn't realize that evolution doesn't try to. The evolutionary hypothesis is predicated on the possibility of abiogenesis, but it certainly doesn't claim to explain abiogenesis. That is a separate but related topic that's still in the early stages of research. There is much we don't know about what may or may not have happened on this planet 4 billion years ago. But we do have a lot of good reasons to say that it still appears plausible. Primarily, from a thermodynamic point of view, life is favored. It may be difficult for life to get a foothold, but once it does, it doesn't let go. We know that the constituent components, the lipids, the amino acids, the nucleic acids, all form naturally. We know that bubbles of lipids can enclose cell-like systems of the other organic molecules, which can have active chemistry. We know that certain minerals can catalyze many biochemical processes, especially when the thermodynamic equilibrium shifts. And the sun has always moved across our sky, driving cycles, most directly light-dark cycles, but also hot-cold and wet-dry cycles. Across the planet, trillions of protocells would have been exposed to these cycles and driven by them into various chemical reactions. Only one needs to get lucky enough to copy itself for natural selection to have a chance to kick off. So while I fully concede that I have no direct evidence for abiogenesis, neither do I have any conclusive evidence against it. And so I have no problems inferring from the evidence I do have in support of evolution that abiogenesis possibly explains the origins of this living planet we are a part of.
There's life reproducing that has offspring, which has variation, which might be the most complex thing about life.
The way modern life, such as ourselves, reproduces is nothing like the way early cells would have reproduced. Our more evolved version only looks complex because it's mixed together with all the other functions life developed. But self-replication itself, in its most basic form, is extremely simple. Crystals self-replicate. You start with a seed crystal, and as long as the material is available and the environment is right, the self-replication just happens. Crystals don't have the variability for evolution to act on them, but it does go to demonstrate the potential simplicity of that aspect of life. And for living things which do produce variable offspring, this isn't as incredible a mechanism as some might suspect. Self-replication without variation is the same as errorless perfect replication. Variation just means that there are errors, inconsistencies in the replication process. I would think life must be more complex were it able to perfectly clone itself every time with no variation whatsoever between parent and descendants, in spite of their complex biochemistry.
I want to be really careful here and not confuse anybody, so I'll restate again that I think macroevolution is false. I think it's a mistake. But we want to consider what it would mean if we're wrong and in fact it is true.
This is the line that convinced me to put this in the theism's best category rather than apologists understand nothing. Yes, Adam has some fundamental misunderstandings about what information and mutations are, but I don't think any of it is coming from a place of dishonesty. He's clearly willing to try to understand the other side and acknowledge the possibility that he could be wrong, and I laud him for that. But to answer the question on screen, it's the same as whether evolution disproves God. Of course not. Maybe some literal interpretation of Christianity clash with evolution, but there are certainly many other variants that can account for it. But I myself could not say with a straight face that Jesus couldn't have risen from the dead because life undergoes natural selection. Maybe some of the theology about why Christ had to die changes, given that Adam and Eve could no longer be taken literally, but it's possible for the beliefs to survive through reinterpretation of the scriptures. The rest of the video is Adam talking through some of these theological considerations, which I'm not particularly interested in. From where I'm sitting, the fact that he must consider such reinterpretations may not be proof that he's wrong, but I do see it as a symptom of the unreliability of faith. Neither is evolution a disproof against God's existence, but it is a wonderful counterpoint to Paleo's argument of design. But don't take my word for it. Go read a fucking book.